presentation of Lawrence of Arabia, author, poet, and patron. I would like to thank the Dorset group of the T.E. Lawrence Society for being able to not only be here today for this event, but for helping to make this international event possible for us. And I would just like to mention a little bit about the program that we're about to see today. We have a reading list that was culminated by the Society, which I had sent out in a previous email, but if anyone would like to receive that list, I could definitely email it out to them again, gladly. We also have a few things just in the beginning for me to go over. What we'll do is, during the Q&A, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type your questions in the chat. If you'd like to use the raise hand feature, you're welcome to do so, which is located on the right-hand side of your name. And then when we get to the Q&A portion at the end, we'll acknowledge the question. I just would like to welcome everyone from the East Hampton Library and everyone zooming in from whatever part of this planet that you're from today. Welcome. Our guest speakers today join us from Great Britain, Canada, and the United States. All are members of the T.E. Lawrence Society, which is an organization that promotes research and education on Lawrence's life, works, and era. They will speak to us today on Lawrence of Arabia, his life as author, collector, patron, and publisher. Many think of Thomas Edward Lawrence as the hero depicted in David Lean's famous film, Lawrence of Arabia, the British officer in Arab dress who led the Bedouins to victory in the First World War and drove the Turks out of Africa. But beyond this romantic image lays a much more complex and interesting man. And this is revealed in the years following the war, when he became author, publisher, collector of books and music, patron of the arts, and a member of British literary circles. In fact, Lawrence himself hoped history would remember him not as a man of action, but as a man of letters. And our speakers will introduce you to him today in the following order. And I just would like to read a little bit about what our speakers are going to discuss today. Johnson Allen asks, who was T.E. Lawrence and why is he still important today? Tony Gill describes how his home at Clouds Hill was central to his literary life. Lorraine Tinsley will speak on the books he carried in the war and their importance to him. Susan Vincent will talk about Lawrence's achievements as both an author and a translator. George Thompson will speak on Lawrence's roles as a patron of the visual arts and publisher. Martin Gething will describe Lawrence's passion for collecting books and music. Neill Child will tell us about Lawrence's literary circle that's centered on Clouds Hill. And Susan Vincent will conclude today's presentation. And I would also like to welcome members of the National Committee of the T.E. Lawrence Society, Vice Chair Kevin Winter, and Kevin will say a few words at the end of today's program. So without further ado, take it away, John.
Thank you so much, Steve. Well, first of all, we are all delighted to be here with you in East Hampton, even if only virtually. Now, as you said, I'm John Johnson Allen, and my task is to introduce you to T.E. Lawrence and to explain who he was and why he is still important today. Who was T.E. Lawrence? Born in 1888 in Tremaddock, North Wales, he was the illegitimate second son of an Anglo-Irish baronet, Sir Thomas Chapman, who had left his wife to run away with the family's nursemaid, Sarah Lawrence. It was her surname that the 5 sons of the Union were given. He was a good scholar, who after Oxford High School won a scholarship to Jesus College, Oxford. There his interests were in medieval castle architecture and antiquities and Arabia. He was an aspiring archaeologist who joined a British Museum dig at the site in Carchemish in northern Syria, which lasted for 4 years. He also embraced Arabic culture and became fluent in Arabic. He was also, after his time at Carchemish, a spy. He was part of an intelligence gathering operation in the Sinai Peninsula. It was ostensibly for historical research, but was in reality collecting information about Turkish operations in the area. At the outbreak of the First World War, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the British Army. Because of his past experience in the region, he was focused on the Middle East. He was posted to Cairo in 1914, and it was from there that he travelled to meet Emir Faisal, the second son of Hussein, Sheriff of Mecca. He was a liaison officer, embedded with the Arab irregular forces led by Faisal as part of the Arab Revolt against the occupying Ottoman Empire. His 2 years in the desert is remembered in the book for which he is most famous, 7 Pillars of Wisdom. In 1919, he became a diplomat, accompanying Faisal to the Versailles Peace Conference to advocate the cause for Arab self-determination. Continuing this role in 1921 with the British Colonial Office, he helped to establish the boundaries of Jordan and Syria as they are today. He was a reluctant hero, walking backwards into the limelight created by the American journalist Lowell Thomas, who had visited him in the desert and who portrayed him as a modern-day crusading hero who liberated the Holy Land from the clutches of the Ottoman Empire. He was a rebel. At the end of the war, he refused the honours that were thrust upon him, left the army, changed his name and sought anonymity as a ranker in the armed forces, where he remained, becoming, in his words, a fitter, working on fast motorboats, including his beloved Biscayne Baby speedboat. He was an author, not just for the 7 Pillars of Wisdom, but for other books that followed, including The Mint, his account of his experiences as a ranker. He was a friend of the great and good, including Winston Churchill, Nancy Astor, George Bernard Shaw, Thomas Hardy, and many others. He was a prodigious correspondent. The book, The Collected Letters of T.E. Lawrence, contains only 583 of his letters out of a huge number. The recipients include Siegfried Sassoon, Lord Trenchard, who was at the time the head of the Royal Air Force, Winston Churchill, Cecil Day-Lewis, and Edward Elgar. He was the complete example of a Renaissance man, or perhaps in today's usage, a polymath. He was, in short, a legend. Secondly, why is he still important today in the second decade of the 21st century? As I've shown, his achievements spanned many subjects, including literature and archaeology. Lawrence, from his emergence in 1920 as a war hero, has fascinated generations to this day. His life has been studied and adapted over decades to meet the needs of each era. As an illustration of this, I continue with why his war in the Arabian desert has been rediscovered by military leaders in the 21st century and his methods used to advantage. His ideas on military theory, including the use of naval force as a part of the military equation, were used at regular intervals during the 20th century as a source of wisdom on irregular warfare, and his ideas continue to be used in the 21st century by those countering insurgency as an authority on irregular military operations. He is important as a military strategist who studied the writings of the 19th century Prussian general and military theorist Karl von Clausewitz. He was able to translate that knowledge and be one of the first military leaders to understand the importance of knowing the character of the men he met and led, an early proponent of the principle of human intelligence. Although he wasn't a professional soldier, he understood that a dedication to the knowledge and understanding of the factors involved in conflict was the way to military success. Before he took a decision in the field, he considered all the factors that would affect that decision, which included the geography, the structure of the tribe, its religion, social customs and language, and their appetites and standards. This thorough immersion in tactics and strategy has been valuable to 21st century military professionals. Some of the ongoing themes that he espoused, such as the value of true leadership and the study of war in all its forms, are now essential to prepare for the making of decisions under conditions of stress and urgency during a conflict situation. He also promoted the study of psychology in war and the behaviours that come from the state of mind that exists in wartime. In summary, it was his ability to dilute the essence of war into a few salient points which show him as a military thinker of note. In the Gulf and in the Iraq wars, Allied officers were all provided with copies of 7 Pillars of Wisdom and his 27 articles. Jeremy Wilson, in his biography, noted of the latter, they provide a remarkable insight into the methods he used to direct operations without being seen to do so. It is this element of the person that was T.E. Lawrence that makes him an important contemporary military thinker in the 21st century. I will now pass you over to Tony Gill, who will tell you about Clouds Hill, Lawrence's home in Dorset, which begins the more detailed discussion of the various factors of his life and achievements. Thank you very much. Tony.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Right, so yes, this is Clouds Hill today. As John mentioned, it became Lawrence's home, so he had it 1923 to 1935. So there's a grand tradition of writers, artists and thinkers having their own space. In Virginia Woolf's famous phrase, a room of one's own. Thoreau had his cabin, Van Gogh the Yellow House, and for Lawrence, the need for sanctuary culminated at Clouds Hill. Throughout his life, he was drawn to places without distraction, where he could pursue his own interests. You can see the 3 examples there. Ever since his parents had built for their exceptional son a small bungalow at the family home in Oxford, Lawrence's unconventional lifestyle would periodically take him to quiet corners to read, write and study. Contentment was found in college libraries, where he fed his imagination with thousands of books. Later, after the war, it was to a cold London attic room to hurriedly rewrite 7 Pillars of Wisdom. In March 1923, Lawrence arrived at Bovington Camp, a large army base located in Dorset in the south of England. Publicly famous, but personally in turmoil, Lawrence had turned his back on the Middle East and was now seeking anonymity by enlisting as a private in the ranks. He had presented the final manuscript of 7 Pillars to the Bodleian in Oxford and had already circulated printed copies to trusted friends for comment. Bovington was an opportunity to consolidate his literary aspirations and earn much needed income. So when publisher Jonathan Cape offered him translation work, he coveted somewhere away from the hubbub of army life. During that summer, Lawrence discovered a ruined cottage a mile north of camp and saw its potential. Already leased to Staff Sergeant Arthur Knowles, who was building a home for his growing family across the road, Lawrence approached the sergeant and soon after took on the dilapidated cottage for 10 shillings a month. He soon set about making the place as habitable as his Spartan taste would allow. Short of money, he sold his iconic gold dagger to Lionel Curtis for £125 to help pay for renovations. It had been crafted in Mecca, but such treasures from Arabia were now being traded as the reality of his current predicament began to sink in. His letters exquisitely convey life at the cottage. To RAF friend Jock Chambers, he wrote, "The cottage is alone in a dip in the moor, very quiet, very lonely, very bare. furnished with a bed, a bicycle, 3 chairs, 100 books, a gramophone of parts, a table, many windows, oak trees and ilex, birch, firs, rhododendron, laurels, heather, Dorsetshire to look at. No food, except what a grocer and the camp shops and canteens provide. Milk, wood, fuel for picking up. I don't sleep here, but come out at 4:30 p.m. till 9 p.m. nearly every evening and dream or write or read by the fire or play Beethoven or Mozart to myself on the box. As implied, there was no electricity, no running water, and, in case you were wondering, no toilet. It was a damp, dark, dilapidated hovel, but it was his. What the cottage lacked in amenities was soon made up for in other ways. There were roaring fires, tea and toast, music, conversation and guests, fellow soldiers from camp, and then the great and the good that had begun to seek Lawrence out and question his apparent volte-face. On occasion, Clouds Hill resembled, as Lawrence memorably put it to Charlotte Shaw, a mixed grill, where lowly servicemen could interact with famous writers and artists. To emphasize this point, Lawrence carved the words "ou frontis" in Greek on the lintel above the front door. It is variously translated as "no care" or "why worry," a convivial greeting to all who came to visit. In due course, Lawrence left the army and Dorset to return to his beloved RAF. Time spent here became fleeting, with tenants and even family members coming to live here in his absence. Piecemeal improvements continued, with Lawrence remodelling Clouds Hill according to his tastes and lifestyle. It remained masculine and spare, a personality in brick, wood, iron and leather. His only major concession to comfort was a bathtub and water boiler, installed late in 1933 to soothe his tired bones. It was his dogged translation of the Odyssey that had paid for such a luxury, and in acknowledgement of this, the bath was christened Homer. So what was Clouds Hill? A bolt hole and monastic cell, but also a convivial spot to enlighten and entertain, a pied-à-terre, and finally, a home. Perhaps foremost, it was a repository for everything Lawrence held dear, notably the gramophone records, and especially the printed word. So that's a little about Clouds Hill and what it meant to Lawrence. And let me just finish there. And I'll now pass you over to Lorraine Tinsley to tell you more about some of his books. Lorraine.
Thank you very much, Tony, and hello, everyone. Against the backdrop of Lawrence's varied exploits as archaeologist, spy, and guerrilla leader, the breadth of his interests as a bibliophile, coupled with his vast linguistic skills, appear nothing short of astonishing. Like most Edwardian scholar adventurers of his day, books accompanied Lawrence wherever he traveled, on foot through Palestine and Syria as an Oxford undergraduate in 1909, as an archaeologist in Turkey from 1911 to 1914, and during the First World War in Arabia. Lawrence wrote, "My books in Arabia were the Mort d'Arthur, Aristophanes. I read all the piece in Latin very gratefully and without much technical trouble, and the Oxford Book of English Verse. Not so fastidious after all," end of quote. It is in fact these books that are immortalized in Eric Kennington's sublime marble effigy of Lawrence, reclining like a Crusader knight dressed in flowing Arab robes. Beside his pillow are his 3 books, left untitled by the sculptor. But why, of all the books Lawrence loved, did he choose to carry these 3 into battle? Well, as he told his family, the fact of their being on hand gives one a sense of security. It's like having a balance in books. And these books reflect 3 of his deepest passions: medievalism, the Greek classics, and poetry. From his youth, Lawrence had developed a profound sympathy with the medieval world and its values of chivalry and honor, influenced by his reading of early Arabic poetry, medieval chansons de geste, and the Provençal romances of the troubadours. From his youthful enthusiasm for brass rubbing in the churches of Oxfordshire to his undergraduate study of Crusader castles, Lawrence immersed himself in a medieval world, drawn from romantic literature and colored by his vivid imagination. Herein lies the beginning of his idealization of Bedouin culture as a survival of all that had been grandest in the European chivalric tradition, and his reverence for Faisal, the Prince of Mecca, as the beau ideal of the tribal leader who would bring the Arab revolt to its full glory. Auda Abu Tai, the Hawitat warlord who fought alongside Faisal, was to Lawrence like a knight errant. The Arab revolt, he wrote in 7 Pillars of Wisdom, was a chronicle in the spirit of the old men who marched with Bohémond or Coeur de Lion. It is perhaps not surprising then that Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, a 15th century compilation of the legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Holy Grail, would captivate Lawrence during the war. Malory, himself a knight, weaves an Arthur who is the ideal feudal lord, who by his own might wins the submission of his vassals, protects them from outward assault, and settles internal quarrels with justice and wisdom. In the Morte lies the sweep of nobility and chivalry that so inspired Lawrence. In 1918, following one brutal campaign marked by Turkish atrocities, an exhausted and dispirited Lawrence wrote, "In my saddlebags was a Morte d'Arthur. It relieved my disgust." He would read the Morte on the march, sometimes even on camelback in the depths of winter. A fellow officer noted with some consternation that the sight of the little man reading the Morte d'Arthur in a corner of the mess tent with an impish smile on his face was not consoling. As a classical scholar, Lawrence would have studied the ancients in Greek and Latin. His highly respected translation of the Odyssey of Homer from the classical Greek is still in print today. In Arabia, he carried an 1835 Latin translation of the comedies of Aristophanes inscribed Tel, Oxford, 1914. This copy went with me through the Arab War. That Lawrence specifically mentions the play entitled Peace, one of 6 comedies in this collection, is revealing. All the early plays of Aristophanes were written against the background of the Peloponnesian War, which ended in 421 BC. This play, often satirical and absurd, is notable for its joyous anticipation of a return to peace and an idyllic life in the countryside. However, there is also bitterness in the memory of tragedy and lost hope and unhappy endings. Lawrence was an avid student of poetry, as the more than 300 volumes of verse at Clouds Hill attested. He loved the work of William Morris, Blake, and Coleridge, as well as Hardy, Sassoon, and Housman. He once described poetry as the crown and head, the only essential branch of letters. His vellum-bound 1915 edition of the Oxford Book of English Verse was inscribed, "Bought in Cairo 1916 through Hejaz and Syria, 1917 to 1918. In May 1917, having spent several weeks in the company of the Hawitat tribes and wearying of their excessive feasting, Lawrence reflected, "My heaven might have been a lonely, soft armchair, a bookrest, the complete poets set in Caslon, printed on tough paper. But I had been for 28 years well fed, and if the Arab imagination ran on food bowls, much the more attainable their joy." After the war, Lawrence began compiling a private anthology of over 100 poems which held meaning for him. About a third of these came from the Oxford Book of English Verse. The poems he chose often expressed deep feelings of nostalgia, exhaustion, self-condemnation, and forebodings of death, reflecting the personal crisis he experienced at war's end, arising from his sense of betrayal of the Arab cause. Entitled Minorities, it was published posthumously in 1971. I'll now pass you along to Susan Vincent, who will speak on Lawrence as an author and translator.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to speak about Lawrence of Arabia and his writings. Now, Lawrence's literary reputation rests on a body of writing which is almost entirely autobiographical. That includes some 6,000 letters written between 1906 and his death in 1935. And 2 autobiographical books. The first, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, is an account of his service with the Arab Revolt. The second, The Mint, is centred on his experience as an enlisted man in the Royal Air Force. In his books and letters, Lawrence was an acute observer of himself and other people, places and events. Amongst the most memorable passages in 7 Pillars are the vivid descriptions of desert landscapes and Bedouin tribes. The Mint, written in a very different style to the 7 Pillars, is a work of observation written by a man who actually found himself, albeit willingly, imprisoned in the ranks. Both works now rank among the classics of 20th century literature. His letters are no less remarkable because his correspondence ranged from fellow servicemen to leading figures in the worlds of literature, art, and politics. In most cases, these letters were almost the only vehicle for his relationships, since the circumstances of his life and an enlisted man meant he could rarely meet his friends. Lawrence's talent for writing was evident as early as 1906, when he won first place in English at the Oxford Senior Local Examinations. Learning the result, he quipped, I quote, "I wonder whether there is any profession in which a knowledge of one's own tongue is of the slightest use," end quote. In any event, there was to be no period in Lawrence's life after 1908 when he was not planning or working on a literary project of some kind. Early in the war, while serving in military intelligence, in the Arab Bureau in Cairo in 1915, Lawrence contributed to a classified daily newsletter called the Arab Bulletin. One typically profound piece of writing in the bulletin is in the form of advice to fellow officers when dealing with the Bedouin Arabs. Quote, "Learn all you can, get to know their families, clans and tribes, friends and enemies, wells, hills and roads. Do this by listening and by indirect inquiry. Get to speak their dialect, not yours. Until you can understand their allusions, avoid getting deep into conversation or you will drop bricks." Lawrence's ambition to write a major work was in him before the war, but it was during the Arab Revolt that he realized he now had the subject he'd hoped for. He later confided to a close friend that "the story I have to tell is one of the most splendid ever given to man." 7 Pillars of Wisdom is important as the only written record of the Arab Revolt by someone directly involved. It describes Lawrence's experiences in Arabia from 1916 to 1918 while serving as a British liaison officer to Prince Faisal of Mecca. The book exists in 2 texts. The earlier, completed in 1922, runs to 334,500 words. Sometimes called the Oxford text, it remained unpublished until 1997. From the 1922 text, Lawrence made a revised abridgment, cutting the length to 250,500 words. This he issued in a lavishly illustrated private edition for subscribers in 1926. After his death in 1935, it was published for general circulation. Lawrence also made a further abridgment called Revolt in the Desert. Now, this was published in 1927 in order to pay off debts that he had incurred producing the subscribers edition of 7 Pillars. Revolt in the Desert was a bestseller, but it was superseded after his death in 1935 by the release of the full subscribers edition, which has since become a world classic. It was in fact the principal source for David Lean's 1962 film, Lawrence of Arabia. Well over 1 million copies to date have been sold, and the book has been extensively translated. The following passages illustrate Lawrence's lyrical and poetic writing style and explain the enduring appeal of Seven Pillars as a great descriptive work of literature. Quote, "All men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night, in the dusty recesses of their minds, wake in the day to find it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dream with open eyes to make it possible." Quote, "Day was still young as we rode between two great pikes of sandstone to the foot of a long soft slope poured down from the domed hills in front of us. It was tamarisk, cover it, the beginning of the valley of the Rum," they said. The Mint, a much shorter book than Seven Pillars, is written in a somewhat more direct, even brutal style about the harsh realities of military life in the ranks. It is in 3 parts. The first 2 parts describe Lawrence's experiences as an enlisted recruit in the RAF in 1922. The third part describes the latter period of his service life when he was serving at the RAF Cadet College, Cranwell, in 1925 and 1926. This book too has been translated into several languages. When short of subject matter, Lawrence enjoyed translating. "I think," he said, quote, "I think it's the best way of learning to use words. Much harder than choosing one's own ideas and clothing them." The Forest Giant, a French translation, was commissioned by Jonathan Cape and first published in 1924. It was based on a prize-winning novel by Adrien Le Corbeau called Les Gigantesques, an allegory on the life of a giant redwood tree. The Odyssey of Homer, commissioned by the American book designer Bruce Rogers, was translated by Lawrence from the classical Greek and published in 1932 in this exquisitely illustrated edition. Lawrence's mannered prose translation was an immediate success, and it has been continuously in print ever since. I'll now hand you over to George Thompson, who will speak on Lawrence as a patron of the visual arts and publisher. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and good afternoon, everyone. In 1924, Lawrence wrote to E.M. Forster that writers and painters aren't like other men. Meeting them intoxicates me. He sought to satisfy this need for intoxication by combining his goal of printing a fine book with the desire to illustrate it with contemporary British art that he would commission. Lawrence's aspiration to print a unique book dates from 1908, when he envisioned with his friend Vivian Richards to set up a private press that mirrored William Morris's Kelmscott Press. Lawrence kept this goal throughout the war and worked toward it until 1921, when he abandoned it as an objective, but not as an idea. The idea took form as he envisioned his wartime memoir to be printed to his criteria for fine books: an elegant design, handmade paper, exquisite type, decorations, and a handsome binding. It took Lawrence 6 years from the completion of his third draft of his memoir, Seven Pillars of Wisdom, in 1920, until his book was distributed to his 127 subscribers, plus 85 for friends. What kept him going was not only the help of his friends, but his desire to see the art he commissioned reproduced in his book. Lawrence was an unlikely person, given his wealth and knowledge of art, to devote so much time and money to the visual arts. So what explains his commissioning 17 artists to make 118 images for his autobiography? The answer lies in his recognition that painters aren't like other men. Lawrence first realized this in 1913 while watching Francis Dodd draw his Arab friend Dahoum. The realization was confirmed in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference, where he became the subject matter for British artists that continued until his death in 1935. Why did he give himself so freely to be their subject? The answer is found in his friend Robert Graves' observation. What he wanted from his literary and artistic experiences was the sense of finding other selves of his own. What makes this observation significant is he applied it in 1920 when he imagined complementing his text with portraits of the persons he had served with. In that year, he educated himself in contemporary art by attending exhibits, and while at Oxford, met artist and war veteran Eric Kennington. Lawrence asked him if he would do a set of images based on his photographs, to which Kennington said, no, because an artist must see their subject in person. Given his own history as an artist model, Lawrence understood Kennington's position. Their mutual commitment resulted in Kennington going to the Middle East and drawing portraits of his Arab comrades, and in 1921 he purchased them, which marked his first step towards becoming a patron. When we consider Lawrence as a patron and publisher, we discover the development of these roles evolved as he faced decisions, completed phases, and met the challenges to bring his book into reality. His next step after the Arab portraits was to commission 10 British artists to make portraits of his British colleagues to balance the Arab ones. If Lawrence stopped with these, it would have been a success, but in 1922, Kennington sent him images that created a new direction for him. Lawrence responded with, I never imagined my chance of getting such pictures. There's a hypnotic suggestiveness which are Blake-like states of mind. He now had two paths. One was his portraits, and the second, contemporary illustrations of his text. By January 1924, when he began to print his memoir, he added a third path by commissioning over 50 tale pieces that were printed in the white areas of his text. Lawrence was not passive in regards to his role. He selected the artists and told them what he wanted, especially not to be old-fashioned. To this end, he succeeded because the art of Seven Pillars represents the best contemporary artists of the 1920s. Lawrence did not continue his ambition to print more fine books after Seven Pillars of Wisdom, nor did he continue as a patron of the arts. But he did show a lingering interest in fine books in two ways. The first was his collaboration with Bruce Rogers. From 1928 to 1932, he translated from Greek the Odyssey of Homer that Rogers designed into one of the most beautiful books of the century. The second is upon retiring from the RAF in 1935. It appears he planned to print his second book, The Mint, because he set up a press at Clouds Hill, and he printed 100 copies of Augustus John's 1929 drawing of him. His decision to print the art was how he began Seven Pillars, by first reproducing the Arab portraits. Unfortunately, his death that year meant we will never know if he would have realized his ambition to establish his press at Clouds Hill. I now pass you over to Martin Gething, who will talk to you about Lawrence as a collector of books and music. Thank you.
Thank you, George. I'll be talking about Lawrence's collections at Clouds Hill, but all his life, Lawrence was a voracious reader. Both as a schoolboy and as an undergraduate at Oxford, he worked his way through probably thousands of books from the university libraries, sometimes several a night. Lawrence wrote that he read every book which interested me in the Oxford Union in 6 years, My father used to get me books while I was at school. Afterwards, I borrowed always 6 volumes a day in his name and my own. For 3 years, I read day and night on a hearthrug, which was a mattress, so that I could fall asleep as I read. Often 18 hours a day, and so good at the job that I could tear the heart out of the soberest book in half an hour. Lawrence preferred reading through the night with no distractions. To his mother, "You know, I think, the joy of getting into a strange country in a book. At home, when I have shut my door, and I know that nothing, not even the dawn, can disturb me in my curtains, only the slow crumbling of the coals in the fire. Why cannot one make one's books live except at night after hours of straining? And, you know, they have to be your own books too, and you have to read them more than once." Right from the start, Lawrence envisaged Clouds Hill to be a place to read in peace, away from the noise of the Bovington Army barracks. At first, storing his books on top of the oak panelling in the upstairs rooms, so that's over here and over here. By December 1926, when he was about to be posted by the Royal Air Force to India, Lawrence had an inventory made which listed over 50 titles, some of them multi-volume editions. On returning to England in 1929, Lawrence gathered up all his books that had been stored with various friends and had them sent to Clouds Hill. To his neighbour, who looked after the cottage for him, "There are lots more books likely to follow. Let me know when the shelving gets full, and then try and find me a carpenter to run shelves like the present, but in oak, the full depth and height of the chimney breast on each side." It's not easy to see here, but the bookshelves are here and here on the either side of the fireplace. That will hold 500 books. Years yet. But it wasn't years yet. He was soon seeking space for well over 1,000 books. They have been in London with friends for 12 years and open to borrowers. There are about 1,000 books surviving, so that 200 or 300 need to be replaced. His solution was to transform the little used kitchen downstairs into a dedicated book room, lined on 3 sides from floor to ceiling with bookshelves. What did he have? Over 30 books on chivalry, many on military strategy, about 300 books on poetry. I like rereading poetry better than prose, I feel, as I get older. And Lawrence also had over 300 novels in English, French, Italian, Spanish and German. The rest were non-fiction, history and philosophy. The full list of books at Clouds Hill was published after he had died by his brother, together with a list of his beloved collection of gramophone records, also built up over many years. A fellow airman, also posted to India with the RAF, wrote that Lawrence's personality was best interpreted to many of us through his choice of music. The barrack rooms had very good acoustic properties. Lawrence was never tired of music, and often from tea time to lights out would run through a whole gamut of composers: Beethoven, Wagner, Schubert, Brahms, Purcell, Delius and Bach. For Clouds Hill, Lawrence bought the best and most expensive gramophone player of the time, discarding its metal needle, which would damage the delicate surface, in favour of a bamboo needle that would need sharpening after every record or two. He would also sprinkle graphite powder on new records to make them play more smoothly. The breadth of his collection was truly impressive. Around 200 gramophone records by over 70 different composers. Lawrence also subscribed to a monthly series of recordings of medieval and Renaissance music. The gramophone player dominates the upstairs music room at Clouds Hill, the room in which he would entertain his visitors with good discussion and jovial informality in which army privates mixed equally with famous authors. And always, but always, with classical music playing in the background. At this point, I pass over to Neill Child, who will talk about Lawrence's literary circle.
Lawrence had from early in his life taken a great interest in literature, particularly poetry. He was a great reader of a wide variety of books and authors, and so it was that his wartime fame gave him the opportunity to meet and mingle with some of the great writers of his day. In 1918, Winston Churchill's secretary, Edward Marsh, introduced Lawrence to Siegfried Sassoon, a poet who later achieved greater fame both through poetry and his book of war experiences, Memoirs of a Fox-Hunting Man, but was already celebrated for his collection of war poems, Counterattack, published in that year. This book had prompted Lawrence to ask for an introduction. Sassoon was his first contact with the literary world of post-war Britain and remained a friend for life. Whilst at a dinner at All Souls College, Oxford in 1920, Lawrence met Robert Graves, then an undergraduate at the university, aged 25. Graves, principally a poet, but also today celebrated for novels such as I, Claudius and his war memoir, Goodbye to All That, had fought on the Western Front. He had a number of poems published during the war and had befriended Sassoon. He and Lawrence became good friends. In 1927, he published Lawrence and the Arabs, a commercially successful biography. He visited Clouds Hill in 1924. In 1923, Lawrence, now at Bovington Army Camp in Dorset, asked Graves for an introduction to Thomas Hardy, who lived at Dorchester some 13 miles away. Hardy was by then 83 and viewed as the grand old man of English literature. Although he himself wished to be best remembered as a poet, his novels such as Far from the Madding Crowd, Tess of the d'Urbervilles, and The Mayor of Casterbridge cement his fame today both in print and on the screen. Lawrence went to tea at the Hardys' invitation at their home. A friendship was formed between him and both Thomas and Florence Hardy, and Lawrence paid several visits to the house called Mac's Gate. Indeed, Florence became one of his most regular correspondents. Lawrence was able to welcome them to tea at Clouds Hill in June 1924, a visit he described as a great honour and dignity for the house. Also in 1923, almost by accident, Lawrence was introduced to George Bernard Shaw, the Irish playwright, critic, and political activist. By then 67, Shaw was already famed for such works as Arms and the Man, Pygmalion, Major Barbara. Later in that year, Lawrence sent a copy of 7 Pillars of Wisdom to Shaw, seeking his opinion with a view to publication. Thus began a long relationship and a voluminous correspondence, particularly with Charlotte, Shaw's wife, who acted almost as a surrogate mother and confidant. Shaw always viewed Lawrence with a quizzical eye, as he did most things, and in 1932 characterised Lawrence in the play Too True to be Good as Private Napoleon Meek. Incidentally, this play was premiered in Boston that year. In December 1923, Lawrence wrote to Shaw, "Will you come to Clouds Hill? I'd like to have you, although it's little worthy of your coming." So on the 2nd of January 1924, the Shaws came to Clouds Hill, having been with Lawrence for lunch at Mac's Gate 3 days before. In 1923, Siegfried Sassoon, with Lawrence's permission, had sent 7 Pillars to the novelist E.M. Forster for his appraisal. Edward Morgan Forster, known to all as Morgan, had by then published A Room with a View and Howard's End. He sent a long and constructive critique, which was greatly appreciated by Lawrence. Forster then met Lawrence in person at Mac's Gate when visiting the Hardys in 1924, and subsequently stayed the weekend at Clouds Hill later in the year. He returned for visits several times, including that afternoon that Mr. and Mrs. Hardy paid their visit, which was also close to the date of the publication of Forster's novel, A Passage to India. After Lawrence's death, he wrote, "The place his spirit will never cease to haunt is Clouds Hill." I now pass you back to Susan Vincent for the concluding remarks.
Thank you. very much. Yes, indeed. This is our concluding remarks for today's presentation. In 1927, long after the end of World War I, Lawrence wrote to publisher Edward Garnett of his hopes that, quote, in the distant future, if the distant future deigns to consider my insignificance, I shall be appraised rather as a man of letters than as a man of action, end quote. We hope that today we have given you some deeper insights into that fascinating side of Lawrence of Arabia. His love of books and music, his home at Clouds Hill as a place of refuge and inspiration, his patronage of visual artists and his interest in fine press printing, his contribution as an author and as a translator of some of the world's great works of literature, and his place in the company of the most influential writers and poets of the early 20th century. Thank you for welcoming us all here to East Hampton Library today. If you'd like to learn more about Lawrence of Arabia, please consider joining us in the T. Lawrence Society. Our website is tellsociety.org.uk, as you can see on the screen in front of you. And we do welcome members worldwide and look forward to seeing you there. I should add that we're very delighted that both our national chairman, Philip Neill, and Kevin Winter, the vice chairman, have joined us on this occasion with other members of the National Committee. And I do have a message from the chairman of our Dorset group, Teresa Jenkins-Teague, who's actually a distant descendant through on her father's side of Lawrence himself, who sends her apologies because she's stranded in Scotland due to COVID, and she has no Wi-Fi. So you can imagine how upset she is not to be with us, but wishes us all well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask if anyone has any questions at this time. The first question is from Tony Sommerstein. It's actually a three-part question. How did Lawrence feel about the Balfour Declaration, and how would he have felt about Israel? That's question one. Two, did he ever write poetry? And she also asks, can you tell us a bit about his personal life?
Who wants to answer that question?
I will take parts of it.
Thank you, George.
That's really one of the most important questions in the contemporary world now that we have the state of Israel established. Very early on, Lawrence revealed his interest in trying to bridge a relationship between the Zionists, particularly John Weitzman, and the Arabs that he saw as he had hoped to see them realize their self-determination. By the time he arranged a meeting with Weitzman and Amir Faisal, the Balfour Declaration had already been published. I don't know his exact thoughts on that, but he recognized that it probably added one more complex issue that was going on at the time. As you know, the Ottoman Empire had crumbled, and the spaces and places were being divided up by the nationalities that lived there, as well as tribal entities, as well as the French and the British. And so it became one more problem for how to balance that. He recognized that out of the mandate system, Palestine would be granted to Britain to oversee its eventual self-determination. That meant that there was a balancing act between the Palestinians, which would be Muslim, and the colonists that were already there. Lawrence's feeling for the relationship was a positive one because he perceived that the expertise and the knowledge of those Jews that were Zionist-oriented would be really important to stimulating the economy and the growth. Already that was a proven reality for the colonists that had already settled in Israel before the war. So his relationship was the hope that the two would commingle and profit from each other's expertise. How he would feel about Israel today, that was not in the horizon at the time, so we'd only be speculating. He probably would feel some empathy for the Palestinians in terms of self-determination, but not surprised at the outcome.
Can I take the next part, which was about poetry?
Sure.
That Lawrence did write one poem, which is the rather enigmatic dedication of Seven Pillars to S.A. Lawrence actually passed his first draft over to Robert Graves, who was a much more famous poet, to rewrite it for him. So what we see published is actually Robert Graves's version of the poem. Graves does actually refer in the book to one other poem, the only other poem that he knows Lawrence of having written, which was a very strange poem, actually about life at Clouds Hill, and that was published in T. Lawrence to his biographer Robert Graves after Lawrence died. So there's only those two poems that we know of Lawrence actually writing himself.
Okay. And the third part of that question was, could you tell us a bit about his personal life?
Do you want me to take that?
Yes, start off, Kevin. Yeah.
You could read many books about Lawrence's personal life. The basic facts are that he was one of 5 brothers, all illegitimate, as we heard from John Johnson Allen earlier. The family, Bob, his older brother, was born in Dublin. The family then moved to Tremarec in North Wales, where T.E. was born. They then moved to Scotland, where Will, his next younger brother, was born. To Jersey, where Frank Helier, Lawrence was born, named after St Helier in Jersey. To Normandy at Dinard, to the New Forest, and eventually to Oxford, where they eventually settled when Lawrence was about 8 years old. And all of the boys then attended Oxford High School for Boys. You've already heard that Lawrence was a good scholar. After Oxford High School for Boys, he gained the scholarship at Jesus College, partly because of his Welsh birth. He then worked as an archaeologist for 3 years, from 1911 to 1914 at Carchemish. And then all of the involvement in the war. We've already heard that he was involved in the peace conference at Versailles, and then also at the Cairo conference in 1921, which finally gave up settlement to the Middle East in creating the states of Transjordan and what we understand today as Iraq. Beyond that, he almost certainly suffered from PTSD and a nervous breakdown, and that period was when he sort of backed into the ranks, first into the RAF from 1922, and after being found out by the press, he was then forced to leave the RAF and join the Royal Tank Corps at Bovington, which is where he then purchased Clouds Hill. In 1925, he was allowed back into the RAF, and from there, I think he settled down in those last few years. Certainly in 1927, he had gone to India and up to the Afghanistan border. But even there, the press pursued him. And due to an outbreak of revolt in Afghanistan, the press thought that he was involved and he was sent back to the UK, probably initiating one of the most settled periods of his life when he worked at RAF Mountbatten on the Snyder Trophy race, and from that, his involvement in small craft. And one of the things that was most remarkable about Lawrence's career was in those last few years of his life, he developed fast rescue launches that rescued so many airmen during World War II, a real lasting legacy. The real tragedy is that in 1935, as most people will know, his love of speed and motorcycles led to him avoiding a collision with 2 young boys on the road back to Clouds Hill. And he lay in a coma for 6 days from the 13th to 19th of May 1935 before passing away. Never married, don't think he was ever interested in sex of any sort, almost actively shied away from personal contact. So a very complex personality. And some of the letters that we see.
Let's see, we have a question was,
Thank you.
how important to the outcome of the Arab Revolt was his work as a spy?
I'll take that one if you like.
Oh, excellent, John.
And the answer is really, no, it really wasn't important at all. When he went from Carchemish, he was employed basically, or he was in it with a colleague, as cover for what the army officer they were with was doing. He was purely there as the archaeologist. He wasn't involved with the army. He had joined the army after that. But one thing that did come out of that trip through the Sinai Peninsula was a book called The Wilderness of Zin, which was partly, I think, written by Lawrence. I don't really know the precise proportion that he was involved in, but it is a record of that particular time. But the answer is really his work as a spy was not important to the outcome of the revolt, I'm afraid.
We have from Allison, who throws in a little message. Can I throw an interesting thought into the mix here that T.E.'s younger brother Will, despite his young age, had also enjoyed significant friendships with two major poets, Ezra Pound and Rabindranath Tagore. T.E. went out of his way to meet them both, probably due to his affection for Will. That's a little anecdote. We have someone who asks, and this was answered, is Cloud Hill open to the public? And we have from Martin, Cloud Hill is open to the public and run by the UK's National Trust. However, due to coronavirus, it closed for 2020.
Could I just come in there? Tony, do you want to just comment on perhaps the future of visits to Clouds Hill?
Yeah, as it stands, as you just heard, apart from basically a week in March at the start of this year, we normally, in a normal year, we just run from March to October. That's our season, 8 months.
Very interesting website.
And of course, this year with the pandemic, we barely opened before we had to close again. We have a massive volunteers there who are brilliant, probably about 50, who tell the stories all about Lawrence, any aspect of his life. So we're still waiting to see what's going to happen next year. Obviously, a lot is COVID dependent, but we're hoping to get back there just next March, as per usual, and open again. Things might inevitably be different there. And that's really it at the moment. There's not much to add, I suppose. There's plenty of information out there, background information about Clouds Hill, obviously. But we're just sort of, at the moment, a bit, just waiting to see what happens. It's a waiting game, but we'll get back there. Clouds Hill always endures, it's the one place. It's obviously the one home connected to Lawrence that you can actually visit. Polstead Road and the former home in Oxford, you can't. The other houses, obviously, the family grew up around the country and abroad are obviously all private now, although you can probably visit. But Clouds Hill, it's pretty much the only extant place now with original possessions, and it's, as many of you know who have been, it still exudes a very great atmosphere. Something about it. It's difficult to put your finger on it when you're there, but it's a place that a lot of people find very very special and rightly so. So hopefully, fingers crossed, next year we'll be able to get back there and everyone will be able to come and visit.
And Martin, you've been doing some research on the history of Clouds Hill itself, haven't you?
That's right. In fact, somebody put up a link in the chat to the Clouds Hill website. So if anybody types in Clouds Hill National Trust, they should get to the Clouds Hill website. And on there, one of the pages within that website is a summary of the history of the cottage before Lawrence lived there. It was a farm labourer's cottage during the 19th century. But there's details on the website.
Thank you.
Another question from Leanne. What are the Society's thoughts on Richard Aldington's allegations, 1955, that that many of the claims in Seven Pillars were made up or exaggerated?
Hello, it's Philip Neill here. I could probably give an answer to that.
Yes.
Can we hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can hear you, Philip.
Richard Aldington, when he wrote his book in 1955, one of his, I mean, there's no doubt that Richard Aldington had, he had a chip on his shoulder about what had happened to Lawrence versus himself. He'd suffered in the First World War on the Western Front quite dramatically, and he was a bit embittered by the hero worship that came around Lawrence after the Arabian campaign. But when Aldington wrote his book in 1955, I think what one has to realize is that he was working with very limited access to letters and papers. Arnold Lawrence, P.'s younger brother, was very controlling over what was made available after Lawrence's death in 1935 for as long as he could. And he was working with people like Revolt and David Garnett to some extent. And they were really preventing a lot of access to information about Lawrence. And I mean, for instance, there was a lot of letters with Charlotte Shaw, which were just not available at that point when Aldington was writing his biography. So he was working with very limited information. So it's not surprising that it's now shown that his book was, and the claims he was making were either inaccurate or not as strong as he was making out in his book. But he was embittered. He was trying to get back at Lawrence. There's no doubt about that. But he did suffer the campaign against him, and the book, after it was released, it basically destroyed his life, and he went into total obscurity, and he lost a lot of money. So there was a big campaign against him. But remember, he was working with limited information. I don't know if anybody's got anything else to add to that.
Well, we could also mention the Great Arab Revolt project, which was an archaeological survey conducted from, I can't remember, 2005 for 7 or 8 years, which was actually looking at the evidence on the ground out in the Middle East. And I think partly to their surprise, the archaeologists actually found a very good match between what was written in Seven Pillars of Wisdom and the evidence on the ground. It correlated very well with what Lawrence had described. Yes. So there are a couple of books that have come out in the last 2 or 3 years, detailing a lot of that evidence and showing that actually Lawrence's account was even more accurate than people had previously thought.
Yeah, good point.
Nick Lunder's new book, Desert Insurgency, which I don't think is out in the US yet, but has been published in the UK, goes into all of the archaeology of that, and it does show that it was very accurate.
Mm. Mm.
And I think I've been recently rereading John Mack's A Prince of Our Disorder, and that's also borne out in that book as well.
I have one from Wells asks, can you give us what Lawrence felt about the Sykes-Picot Agreement? And also perhaps Ms. Tinsley could comment on T. Lawrence's relationship with Gertrude Bell. Many thanks.
Lawrence was not keen on the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and he was not alone. David Hogarth, his mentor, who was with the Arab Bureau and served with him in Cairo, they all had a different vision of how this should be played out. And so when Mark Sykes and Georges Picot created this document, which was mid-war, things had changed rather dramatically by the time the end of the war. And there's some question as whether Mark Sykes really still held to his own diagram of what he thought the territorial arrangements should be made. The reason that Lawrence was not happy with this is because he was an advocate for the Hashemite family, which would be Amir Faisal, Faisal's brother Abdullah, and of course Hussein in the area of Mecca in Hejaz. So the diagram that they came out with really conflicted with the way Lawrence and others had hoped to see the eventual determination of Arab hegemony over various areas. And so particularly the sore and the rubbing point is Syria. The French had long felt that they had a relationship strongly stated with the Maronites in Lebanon back to the Crusades, and they wished to expand upon that by incorporating Syria. And so Lawrence and others were really felt that this would not allow Faisal to take over as the emir, or if you will, the king of Syria. And that is the way it actually played out. He faced those arguments at the Paris Peace Conference. In the end, it was an arrangement between David Lloyd George and Clemenceau that determined what mandates and what areas would be divided up. And in the end of the day, the French received Syria, the British received what would become Iraq at that time, was known as Mesopotamia at that time, and of course would supervise the international mandate for Palestine. So it was not something that he was in favor of, as I said, and several were, others were not as well.
George, it's Phil here. I don't know if everybody's read Rob Johnson's book, Lawrence of Arabia on War, but there's actually a suggestion in that book that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was almost discarded after it was even thought about, and it was never really taken forward as a serious document. And you know, almost that the imperial powers would never have actually used it as a way of dividing up. If you read his book, it's interesting that he makes that comment about the actual agreement.
Sorry, Roger, did you want to come in? Roger Holthouse?
Yeah, are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, I think the first thing one should understand is that Sir Mark Sykes, who came from quite interesting and troubled background himself, although much more moneyed than was Lawrence, was very much the intellectual master of the Middle East in the way that Lawrence saw himself. There was no love lost between them. You could, perhaps being cynical, say there wasn't enough room in the Middle East for two egos that size. So anything that Mark Sykes came up with, Lawrence was going to be predisposed to dislike. Sir Mark Sykes was an MP before the war, and so had a lot more political clout at home. The Sykes-Picot Agreement with Francois-Georges Picot was negotiated essentially as a means of the modern military term is deconflicting. I think that translates across the Atlantic. French interest and British interests, and was largely written around spheres of influence, which for those of you who are not into diplomatic terminology, a sphere of influence is an area over which one great power says, I'll be the big boy in town, I don't want to rule it, but the principal thing is I don't want anybody else to muscle in and start making trouble. It was first articulated by US President James Monroe in 1823, which basically said, and he basically articulated that the US saw the Americas, North and South, as an American sphere of influence and didn't want other great powers stirring the pot. Britain saw a sphere of influence around the Persian Gulf and around Egypt, had no vital interest whatsoever in Syria. France had an emotional attachment, as has already been said, to Syria, going back to the Crusades. Though, as an aside, I would say if they really wanted to wind the clock back that far, they also ought to take account of the fact that at that stage, Britain owned, or England owned, quite a large portion of France, and could we have it back, please, including all the wine making bits. Yeah, history is a very difficult thing to unwind. By the end of the war, Sykes-Picot, in Sykes's mind, was discredited as no more than a temporary expedient, an exercise in the hypothetical. The French clung to it as a lever. When the bottom line, however, was Britain wasn't prepared to face down France, if necessary, to the point of war, and the French were really exercised about Syria, which Britain didn't want. And frankly, with the resources available at that stage of demobilization going on, Britain, like the US, has no standing army. France, like most continental powers, did. It wasn't worth Syria wasn't worth the hassle with the French. Let's not forget that let's not forget that Faisal did set up for an Arab state in Syria in 1920. The French conception of the sphere of influence was to roll in and occupy it. Difference between colonialism and sphere of influence. I could bang on all night, but my wife's giving me a kick. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you. Are we ready for Lorraine now to talk about Gertrude Bell?
Yes, the question was about the relationship between T.E. Lawrence and Gertrude Bell, subject close to my heart. They first met as archaeologists in 1911 in Carchemish. Gertrude Bell was 20 years older than Lawrence, practicing archaeologist and an explorer, a remarkable woman, a very accomplished scholar, linguist, and adventurer who covered some 25,000 miles across the deserts of Arabia and Mesopotamia and Syria solo between the late 1890s and First World War. They met up in 1911 when Lawrence was assisting on the British Museum's excavations in Carchemish in northern Syria on the border of Turkey, under the leadership of his mentor from Oxford, David Hogarth, a remarkable man in his own right, an accomplished archaeologist and writer who was also the keeper of the Ashmolean Museum. He had been Lawrence's mentor in modeling college, and was like a father figure to Lawrence as well as to Gertrude Bell. Interestingly, they both shared a deep attachment and a love for Hogarth, and he for them. And it's probably Hogarth who brought them together and kept them together as their somewhat fractious relationship transpired over the course of the First World War and afterwards. By the time war broke out, Bell's prolific familiarity with the tribes of Mesopotamia, garnered from her explorations there, made her probably the principal source on the allegiances of those tribes. And for that, she was invaluable for the intelligence effort headquartered in Egypt in 1914, 1915 when she joined. Lawrence was already there in military intelligence, along with a remarkable group of adventurers, as they came to be known, headed by Hogarth. These were scholars and diplomats, travelers, Arabists, and military people who had been brought together for their expertise on the tribes and on the allegiances in the Middle East to work in military intelligence for the British out of Cairo. So Gertrude Bell and Lawrence found themselves together again in 1914. Shortly after that, shortly after that, Lawrence went off to aid Faisal in the Arab Revolt in 1916, and Gertrude Bell went off to Mesopotamia, first to Basra and then Baghdad, where she remained until the end of her life in 1926 as the highest ranking woman in the British administration during and after the First World War in the Middle East, the equivalent of a cabinet member rank. She was the Oriental Secretary to Percy Cox, the head of the British administration in Baghdad. From then on, from that point on where they separated, they still maintained a great deal of communication on intelligence matters and movements of the tribes. Bell was still working for the Arab Bureau, but based in Basra and Baghdad. And Lawrence was corresponding with headquarters and with her through Hogarth on intelligence of tribal movements and allegiances and so forth. They were both plumping for the Sharif, as Gertrude Bell put it, and they maintained that contact right through to the end of the war, when they both then were prominent in the negotiations in Paris, the Paris peace talks in 1919, both fighting for the promises that the British had made to the Arabs on self-determination, not terribly successfully. In 1919, Gertrude Bell went off back to Baghdad, and shortly after that, we saw the Mesopotamian revolt after the San Remo provisions upset many of the Arabs in Mesopotamia. And similar revolts were breaking out in Egypt at the same time. It was a very volatile period following the war, as the League of Nations was being established and these mandates were being developed. There was a great deal of dissatisfaction among the Arab populations of the countries involved. Gertrude Bell was doing her best as a master communicator and liaison between the tribes and the newly installed first king of Iraq, Faisal, in 1921. But not without a lot of criticism from Lawrence, who was sending some very, very pointed analyses through the newspapers about the British mishandling, what he felt was the mishandling of the mandate in Mesopotamia. So he and Gertrude Bell came to loggerheads in that period. Bell was complaining privately about the tosh Lawrence was writing in the newspapers about the situation in Mesopotamia and how he ought to know better what it was like on the ground. They came together one more time in 1921 in the Cairo Conference that was orchestrated by Winston Churchill to establish the state of Transjordan, the new kingdom of Iraq, and to place an administration in Palestine under the mandate administrations. So they were there together in that Cairo conference. Gertrude Bell, of course, being the only woman in, as always, among, I think, 44 delegates. She stands out in these photographs with her feathered boa hats and scarves and looking very elegant in among the crowds of military officers and Arab dignitaries. But she was revered by the Iraqi people, the British not so much. Gertrude Bell devoted her life to them. And she corresponded with Lawrence after that on the 7 Pillars of Wisdom, as he was drawing to the decision of whether to print that as a subscriber's edition or not. She encouraged him to do that. And they had just a small amount of correspondence after that. So the friendship they had was fractious at times, but it was very, it had its elements of mutual respect and affection. They relied on each other's influence and intelligence during the war, and they remained friends following the war right up until her death in 1926.
Oh,
Thank you.
Very
Thank you
much.
very much.
Thank you. Lorraine, that's wonderful. Very moving. Thank you.
I'll read some of the comments. We have from Mark, thank you, Lorraine, for such a thoughtful explication of Gertrude Bell's role. From Clive, thanks for the presentations, very engaging and informative. Wells says, thanks to all the speakers. Chris says, many thanks to everyone for this. Wells, thanks, Lorraine. Allison says, thank you so much. We had a few. Deborah says, this is such a wonderful forum. I didn't know much about Lawrence outside of the feature film. Today I have decided to start reading more about him. You really impressed me with your depth and intelligence, as well as your generosity.
How accurate was the film? Because the film was just shown this past weekend, actually, and I just saw it again.
Ah.
It was shown on Turner Classic Movies.
Martin, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah,
the film and how
gives you a very good idea of what the fighting was like, what the conditions were like. The film is actually quite true to Seven Pillars. Obviously, it's showing a fairly limited view of the war in the Middle East. So you have to bear in mind that you're only seeing a very small portion of the war that was going on. As with Seven Pillars of Wisdom itself, you're only really getting the view of Lawrence on the back of his camel in the middle of the desert. So, you know, it's good cinematography. It's a good ripping yarn. Enjoy it.
Thank you all. This was so wonderful.
I see a question that we hoped would be asked from Deborah Fisher. What's the best book that we would recommend to newcomers to T.E. Lawrence and his life and work? We've talked about this at great length. We each have a different opinion. I would recommend for a first-timer Michael Korda's biography of Lawrence called Hero. It's a lovely, it's very engagingly written. It's not it doesn't purport to be a scholarly work, but it has a great deal of insight, and it's a hefty book. You will learn a lot, but it's a good read. There are others that are more analytical, others that are more scholarly, depending on your interests. But I'm going to pass that along to my colleagues, because we each have our favorites.
Let me, if I can weigh in on this, I think Lorraine's insight in terms of recommending Korda's book is spot on. One of the things that you probably have taken away is the complexity of this man over several generations. And so different writers come to him in different ways. So, you know, even if you wanted to start at the beginning, you'd maybe even look at Lowell Thomas. What did Lowell Thomas do for creating the myth and legend? But then fast forward to Robert Graves, he was mentioned in terms of his first a biography that Lawrence endorsed in 1927. But then it's in the 1950s and on that probably holds most of our interest. And so if one is starting a journey to understand Lawrence, then if you go from Korda, you might then look at Jeremy Wilson's authorized biography, a very large and thick book, but quite important in terms of giving you a framework to understand Lawrence's life. My favorite is John Mack's Prince of Our Disorder, and it falls within what Lorraine was talking, more analytical. Mack received the Pulitzer Prize, gave a talk at the Society years ago, and unfortunately, his life was taken in a car wreck in London shortly after giving his talk. But Prince of Our Disorder explores the complexity of Lawrence's psychological life and his profile, and is really a must-have. There was one book that kind of came up when Martin was talking about Clouds Hill, and that is T.E. Lawrence by His Friends. That's the only volume of a collection, an anthology of essays put together by Arnold Wilson, Lawrence's youngest brother. And in that, not only do you have these vignettes by people who knew him, like Kennington and Trenchard and others, but also those remarkable lists of the books that Martin showed you in terms of, and the records. So it's available in paperback. It's one of those essentials. So now I could just keep going on, but I'm sure my colleagues will have a few of their favorites.
I'd just like to echo, if I could, what everyone said so far, George and Lorraine. I remember when I first got into Lawrence, I was recommended two books. One was T. Lawrence by His Friends, which is it's a very good, easy read. And the other one, of course, was his letters. There's two major volumes of his letters. One was done by Malcolm Brown in 1988, but the first one by David Garnett in 1938. You just have to go and read those, and you get Lawrence from the horse's mouth, as it were, and that was a very good starting point. You know, read his letters because they are phenomenal.
We should also say that there is a reading list that was attached to the joining instructions for this particular Zoom meeting. So there are details of a lot of the books that we've talked about on the reading list. And for my own preference, as the contrast to Jeremy Wilson's very thick and sometimes quite dry autobiography, it's vitally important because it's got all the details in there. But a view of Lawrence as the man in his off-duty, informal periods, I would recommend The Golden Rain by Claire Sidney Smith, which is a very light and easy to read book, but it gives a really good picture of Lawrence, as I say, in his off-duty moments.
Thank you. What about you, Neil?
Yeah, I can only endorse everything, all the titles. To be honest, yes. So I think it's covered it very nicely for my part. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, John. Do you have a favourite?
I have nothing to add to what's already been said. It's been covered so thoroughly. I really don't think I could come into it. I would just underline John E. Mack. I think it was a wonderful book. So yeah, that will be one of the basics for me.
And
Yes.
your own one, of course, John.
Sorry?
And your own book.
Well, I'm too modest to mention my own.
Sea Patrol, we have to say that is.
T. Lawrence and the Red Sea Patrol.
Yes.
That covers the maritime side of it.
I myself, I obviously agree with all my colleagues, absolutely. But a book that I found was very useful when I was starting off trying to understand about the complex life of Lawrence was by Harold Orland's T. Lawrence, the Broken Hero, because he takes each section of Lawrence's life, his friends, his early life, his death, and so on, and very clearly explains it. And that got me then into the more detailed books. I completely agree with Tony about reading his letters. I've recently started reading again some of the detailed letters, the letters of T. Lawrence I've got here by David Garnett, and they are absolutely amazing because you actually are hearing his own voice. And there's another volume about Lawrence talking to his family, specifically to, and letters of his brother to himself. And there is one final comment I would make. Harold Orlands has also produced a book on the literary criticism of Lawrence. And Lawrence actually used to make quite interesting comments on all the famous authors of the day, George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, etc. And reading his views on these famous writers may not always have been to their face, but perhaps behind their back in letters to other people. It's quite fascinating. Lorraine.
Yeah, I was just going to add that Susan introduced everyone to the abridgment of Seven Pillars of Wisdom that Lawrence produced in 1927, called Revolt in the Desert. And it is a much shorter version of what became the Seven Pillars of Wisdom. and is a little easier in to the Arab Revolt in Lawrence's own words. For those who might find Seven Pillars a bit daunting, as most of us do, there's this one to start with. I don't know that it has been reprinted, has it, Martin?
Oh,
you know?
Yes, it's in print.
Is it? Is it in
Oh
print?
yes, it's in paperback. And I agree with you, Lorraine, that it really is a good entry point because it gives you the syllabus and the skeletal structure. What's different in Seven Pillars is the more introspective assessment in terms of his own life and his own personality in relationship to the Arab culture and so forth is really what fills out Seven Pillars of Wisdom. And so Revolt in the Desert is I think, a must own and a must read.
It's also Revolt in the Desert for our East Hampton or Suffolk County patrons is also available in electronic book as downloadable, as is the full Seven Pillars, also available as a downloadable from our library database. I searched some of the titles that were suggested, and quite a number of them are available in ebook form in the Suffolk County catalog. So for those that like to read on their Kindle or their iPad, by all means, there's ample copies out there electronically. But we could also get for you the hardcover copies if you'd like to read the regular hard copy books. We do have quite a number of the books on the reading list in our collection, as well as in the library consortia, so we could always interloan from other libraries if anyone's interested in seeking any of the titles out.
Oh, thank you. I wonder, we've got someone, I don't know if he's still in the audience, called Joe Burton, who seems to have his video off and his microphone off, but he's a great friend of the Society, a member of the Society, always has a lot of interesting things to say. I don't know, Joe, are you still there? Whether you can unmute your microphone and come in? Or has he gone?
I'm still there, but I'm muted, I'm afraid.
Well, if he's not there, then you can read his book.
Thank you.
Joe Burton's T.E. Lawrence and the Arab Revolt, an illustrated guides, magnificent. Sometimes having pictures, and there are so many phenomenal images of Lawrence and of this time. It makes this entry into this world a lot more amenable and enjoyable.
Thank you. Well, certainly if we are invited back to do another Zoom with you all, we'll bring Joe in with us next time.
Good certainly hear Joe just now.
I'm sitting here with a new laptop and haven't quite figured out the visual component, but I can assure you I still look the same. So I think it's been a fascinating discussion. It's wonderful to have the convenience of Zoom to bring all of you scholars together and to share your words of wisdom with, I think, a new audience that we usually don't reach. So thank each of you. I thank each of you for your contributions. It was really a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mark Tovey. Mark put the WorldCat links to all of the books that were suggested by members of the group in the chat box. The thing with the WorldCat link will give you a list of all of the libraries throughout the planet Earth that hold copies of the books. And many libraries, if they're part of a consortia like East Hampton is, part of the Suffolk County catalog, we can interloan titles from other libraries and universities. So those WorldCat links, they also, one of the great things about WorldCat is you get subject headings and a little bit of summary about the book. And even now they have some reviews from various publications like New York Times, London Times. You'll have all of the local newspapers, as well as Publishers Weekly, and what I like to use, book lists. Those publications have very good reviews. So in WorldCat now, there are links to those if the book was reviewed. So it really helps with book selection now.
Thank you. I think it's probably worth mentioning to everyone that for the sake of, I think, about £24, I'm not quite sure what that is in dollars, if you join the society, you'd have 2 to 3 copies of the newsletter every year and 2 copies of a very detailed academic journal. And those journal articles actually are very, very revealing. They're like mini books in themselves. I think my colleagues would agree with that. And so, you know, maybe definitely worth thinking about that. And if you go on the website, you can see the list of all the journals. And Martin here is the editor of the newsletter. I don't know if you want to comment, Martin. Sorry.
I mean, the newsletter talks about things that are going on now. It's about what the society is doing, the meetings we have, the outings that we organise, and it's a sort of an informal forum. Whereas the journal is more like the academic articles with lengthy papers on history, historical subjects and so on. So yeah, the two publications complement each other.
Mm.
And Deborah asks for the link to the T. Lawrence Society. So I just put the link up there to the website, tellsociety.org.uk. And yep, it should be in there right now. I could also, when I send, if anybody would like another copy of the reading list, I could send that out to them with the link to the telawrencesociety.org website within the email.
Thank you, Stephen, very much. And I think it's worth mentioning that to everyone in America, that you have George Thompson and Lorraine here, who've recently been appointed by the National Committee to sort of coordinate and beef up, if you like, the membership across North America. So at least if you do join, you'll feel if you're from America, you'll know the 2 people who are going to be there running things for you.
I had a final question. What religion, if any, did he practice, and was he attracted to Islam?
Jeremy Wilson, his authorized biographer, has answered that very question. And the way he put it was that Lawrence was brought up in an evangelical branch of the Church of England. His family held daily prayers, and as a child he attended services at St. Aldgate's Church in Oxford, as well as Bible classes given by Canon Christopher, a noted evangelical preacher. But as an adult, Lawrence ceased to observe any formal religion and went out of his way to avoid religious ceremonies. In the Mint, he wrote that for him, only the first 4 words of the Anglican Creed remained, that's being, I believe in God. His thinking about the origins of Semitic religions is set out in chapter 3 of 7 Pillars of Wisdom.
Thank you.
I thank everybody for an amazing discussion as well as presentation. I definitely one day want to get to visit Cloud Hill, and I'd also like to see Thomas Hardy's home. I find the information provided was just absolutely superbly researched, and definitely keep us posted on any other events that are coming up. And if the group would love to have would like to do another meeting of some sort down the line, we would be more than happy to host it again on our Zoom. This was fantastic, and I thank you for putting in the time to do this for us and bring this event to the East Hampton Library. And with that, have a wonderful evening, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much. And perhaps I could say, sort of, this started off with my Zooming a group of my friends from having met them in the symposium of the Society in 2016. And I then joined one of your Zooms for a book review. And Lawrence of Arabia was mentioned, and I just threw out the idea, and how lucky I was that every member of this group who joined me were willing to support me to do this Zoom, because without them, and many of them know a lot more about Lawrence of Arabia than I do. Many have spent 20, 30 years studying him. I'm fairly new. I've been studying him for the last 6 years, having known of him 30 years. So really, may I just take this opportunity to say thank you to all of those of you who contributed with me, and how wonderful it is for us to realize we've hit the nail on the head, as it were, with you as a wonderful audience. And thank you so much for the wonderful, generous comments you've made to us. It makes up for all the hard work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to the library for doing this for us.
Yes, indeed.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Steve.
Thank you.
You're a lovely
very
host.
much.
Sorry, Lorraine?
Thank you, Steve. You are a wonderful host.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You made us all feel very, very welcome and at ease. That was much appreciated. Thank you for your just for your embrace. It was very kind and welcoming. And I also want to thank all of the audience members who have made such generous and kind comments that I'm watching in the chat bar. I'm very touched. And one person, I think Deborah, said, would we ever have come together like this had it not been for COVID? And probably not. So there's a silver lining in every cloud. And I've just been delighted to be with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's almost sad to leave, isn't it, really?
Okay.
We've only been together 2 hours nearly. When it started off, we thought, gosh, an hour and a half. And we've still got 55 participants. You know, it's wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you, and we shall meet again. Bye-bye.
We hope so.
We look forward to being with you all again. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.